안녕하십니까. 오늘 세미나의 개회식 사회를 맡은 충북대학교 국가위기관리연구소 재난안전혁신센터장 권설아입니다.
I am Sora Gon, the Chief of the Center of Disaster Safety Innovation at National Crisis Tsunami Institute of Chungbuk National University.
오늘 세미나에 참석해 주신 내외 기빈 여러분께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다.
We really appreciate all the guests and especially the special guests participating in this seminar.
그럼 먼저 충북대학교 김수가 총장님께서 개회사를 해주시겠습니다. 여러분 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
To start with, Dr. Suga Kim, the president of Chungbuk National University, will deliver the opening message. Please welcome him with warm round of applause.
오늘날 지구촌 사회가 코비드19를 비롯해서 태풍, 지진, 기후위기 등으로 많은 고통을 겪고 있는 시점에서 제15차 국제위기관리 학술대회를 우리 충북대학교에서 개최하게 된 것을 진심으로 축하드립니다.
Today, at a time when the global community is suffering a lot from COVID-19, typhoons, earthquakes, and climate crisis, I would like to congratulate you on hosting the 15th International Crisis Management Conference at Chungbuk National University.
특히 이번 국제위기관리학술대회는 우리 충북대학교 개교 70주년 기념 국제학술대회로서 공동 주최기관인 대학의 총장의 입장에서도 매우 남다른 의미를 갖고 있다고 생각합니다.
In particular, this International Crisis Management Conference is an international conference commemorating the 70th anniversary of the foundation of Chungbuk National University, and it has a special meaning for me as the president of the university, the co-hosting institution.
충북대학교는 6.25 전쟁이 한창인 1951년 전쟁의 위기가 끝난 후에 대한민국을 이끌어갈 지도자를 양성해야 한다는 숭고한 뜻을 담아 도민 한 분 한 분이 쌀과 보리쌀을 기부하고 벽돌을 쌓아 만든 국립대학이자 민족대학입니다.
Chungbuk National University is a national university and built with bricks by donating rice and barley rice in 1951 in the midst of the Korean War. With the noble will of nurturing leaders who will lead the Republic of Korea after the crisis of war was over.
국가 거점 국립대학으로서 국토의 중심에서 국가의 중추대학으로 도약하기 위해서 전 구성원이 최선의 노력을 다하고 있습니다.
70 years have passed since then. Until now, Chungbuk National University remembers the noble meaning of its founding. To this end, all professors, staff, students, and alumni of Chungbuk National University have done their best to nurture and research talent for the development of local and national societies.
국제사회의 위기관리 학자 및 전문가 여러분,
Fellow international crisis management scholars and experts.
우리 대학은 2006년 12월에 위기관리 분야에서는 국내 최초로 국가위기관리연구소를 설립하여 군사안보위기, 재난위기, 국가 핵심 기반 마비위기, 국민생활안전위기를 체계적으로 연구하기 시작했습니다.
In December 2006, our university established the nation's first National Crisis Management Institute in the field of crisis management and began to systematically study military and security crisis, disaster crisis, national core-based paralysis crisis, and public safety crisis. I also participated in research at the National Criminology Institute at the time.
그리고 우리 대학은 대한민국 최초로 학부에서는 위기관리학 연계 전공을, 대학원에서는 위기관리학과 간 협동과정을 설치하여 석사과정과 박사과정, 석박사 통합과정을 운영하고 있습니다.
Also, our university is the first in Korea to establish a crisis management related major in the undergraduate department and a cooperative course between crisis management departments in the graduate school to operate the master's program, the doctoral program, and the integrated master and doctoral program.
앞으로도 저희 충북대학교는 인류사의 보편적 가치인 인간의 존엄성과 생명, 기본권을 존중하고 구현하기 위해 노력하는 학문인 위기관리학의 발전과 체계화를 위해 노력할 것을 약속드립니다.
In the future, Chungbuk National University promises to strive for the development and systematization of crisis management, a discipline to respect human dignity, life, and fundamental rights, which are universal values of human society.
이러한 맥락에서 이번 국제 위기관리 학술대회 또한 글로벌 사회에서의 기후위기와 재난관리, 인간안보, 경제안보, 환경안보를 주제로 개최하게 되었습니다.
In this context, we set the topic of this International Crisis Management Conference as climate crisis and disaster management in the global society, human security, economic security, and environmental security.
그리고 충북대학교 개교 70주년을 기념하는 제15차 국제 위기관리 학술대회에 참여해 주신 한국, 중국, 일본, 미국, 태국, 스웨덴, 네팔, 몽골, 칠레, 파키스탄의 학자 및 전문가 여러분과 국제기구인 아시아 재난예방센터인 ADPC 관계자 여러분께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다.
In addition, I would like to express my gratitude to all the people involved in ADPC, a prevention center, scholars and experts from Korea, China, Japan, United States, Thailand, Sweden, Nepal, Mongolia, Chile, and Pakistan who have participated in the 15th International Crisis Management Conference to commemorate the 70th anniversary of Chungbuk National University, as well as the International Organization of Asian Disaster.
아울러 이번 국제학술대회를 적극적으로 지원해 주시고 이 자리에 함께 해주신 제15차 ICCEM 조직위원회 배정희 의장님, 충북대학교 국가위기관리연구소 소장이면서 ISCEM 공동회장이신 이재은 교수님, 충북대학교 개교 70주년 기념사업 추진위원회 이문순 위원장님, 그리고 아시아 재난예방센터의 한스 구트만 집행위원장님께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다.
Furthermore, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Chairman Jung Yi-bae of the 15th ICCEM Organizing Committee, who actively supported and attended this international conference, and Professor Jin Lee, the Director of the National Crisis Management Research Center, the ICCEM co-chairman of Chungbuk National University, the 70th Anniversary Project Promotion Committee of Chungbuk National University, Chairman Lee, Moon-sun Lee of the Center for Disaster Prevention, and Hans Gutmann, the executive chairman of the Asian Disaster Prevention Center.
이번 국제위기관리 학술대회를 계기로 우리 충북대학교는 각국의 위기관리학 전문가들이 정보를 교환하고 상호 협력함으로써 전문 역량을 높여나가고 궁극적으로 인류사회의 안전을 위한 연구를 수행하는 데 도움이 될 수 있도록 국제적인 협조 노력을 지속적으로 펼쳐나가도록 하겠습니다.
With this International Crisis Management Conference as an opportunity, Chungbuk National University aims to help crisis management experts from each country exchanging information and cooperating to enhance their professional capabilities and ultimately help to conduct research for the safety of human society. We will continue to expand our international cooperation efforts.
오늘 함께 해주신 여러분께 다시 한번 감사드립니다.
Thanks
고맙습니다.
again to everyone who joined us today. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 다음은 ICCEM 배정희 의장님께서 개회사를 해주시겠습니다. 여러분 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you, President. Next, Dr. Jung Yi-bae, the chair of the organizing committee of the 15th ICCEM, will deliver the opening message. Please welcome her with a warm round of applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jung Yi-bae. I'm from Inje University. I'm also the organizing committee chair for the conference today. I would like to welcome all of you from around the world who have joined us for the 15th ICCEM. Before I start, I would like to thank Professor Lee Jae-eun for preparing this conference today, and as well as President Kim Soo-gap from Chungbuk National University for supporting the conference. Also, I really appreciate from bottom of my heart to the staff and volunteers who worked hard to prepare this conference. Every 6 seconds, someone somewhere in the world is suddenly and tragically killed due to injury caused by safety accidents. Every death for injury leads to dozens of hospitalization, hundreds of emergency department calls, and thousands of medical appointments. Some people suffer long-term and permanent physical and psychological disability from their injuries. In Korea, one person dies every 17 minutes due to an accident. 85 people die every day due to safety accidents, and 120 become disabled. As well, the annual economic loss due to injury deaths amounted to $154 million. What's more, due to global warming, the scale of global disaster is increasing and disasters being combined with one another. This is why today's conference with experts from around the globe with the theme of climate crisis and disaster management in global society is so significant. Over the past 2 years, in response to the global COVID-19 pandemic, many countries around the world have implemented social distancing measures to contain the spread of the coronavirus. While the nation's administrative power and budget were focused on the controlling COVID-19, the number of common accidents such as suicide, violence, and abuse was on the rise. So we have to identify the new disaster management paradigm model in the post-corona era. When we bring together the disaster and crisis management principle of the UN, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Korea are classified the theme into keywords. Some common concepts include participation, cooperation, and responsibility of all members. With global collaboration, we have to weave together best practice in the field of crisis and disaster safety management and evidence-based research. We can make a difference when we choose to work together based on worldwide cooperation. With our effort, we can create a better future for the world. I hope that this conference today will be a new start for the happier future and lead to meaningful discussion. Once again, I really welcome your participation today. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. 다음은 이재은 충북대학교 ICCEM 회장님께서 환영사를 해주시겠습니다. 여러분 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you, Dr. Bae. Next, Dr. Jae-eun Lee, the chair of ISCEM, will deliver his welcoming message. Please welcome him with a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Distinguished scholars and experts in the field of crisis knowing. I'm both glad and honored to welcome you all to the 15th ICCEM, commemorating the 70th anniversary of Chungbuk National University in Korea. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is the most serious catastrophic event the human society has never experienced. Human society has the history of overcoming crisis from the time humans were born on Earth to the present. And we are still living in the history of crisis and emergency management. Obviously, after overcoming this COVID-19, human society will face another new crisis that has never been experienced before, and we will overcome it, I'm sure. Perhaps this moment is also a time to gather wisdom to overcome the COVID-19 that is taking away our lives and start a new life. Since the late 20th century, numerous scholars and experts have agreed that climate change and global warming will bring a new crisis in human history. Recently, due to the seriousness of climate change, so global leaders have started to use the new term, climate crisis, instead of climate change. And if we do not respond quickly and precisely to the climate crisis, it will bring about a number of various disasters that are the most threatening to human survival. Due to the climate crisis, surely we know that these kinds of the climate crisis and climate change is the most catastrophic result to our life. So, scope of disaster that all countries around the world must experience will greatly increase and suffer a lot. Now, we must begin international cooperation to prepare for and manage new types of large-scale disasters caused by the climate crisis. In this context, taking this 15th ICCEM as a starting point, scholars and experts in the field of crisisnomy and disasteronomy should prepare a plan for strengthening international disaster resilience and make efforts to establish a disaster management governance system. Dear global friends, the 15th ICCEM is a very meaningful and valuable international academic event, especially commemorating the 70th anniversary of Chungbuk National University in Korea. On behalf of ICCEM members, I would like to thank President Sugap Kim of Chungbuk National University. President Kim co-hosted the 15th ICCEM as an international academic event to commemorate the 70th anniversary of CBNU, and always supported academic development of crisisnomy and disasteronomy. Thank you once again, President Kim. Chungbuk National University was the first starting point and venue for the first ICCEM, which is a place for discourse and academic festival where global scholars and experts in the field of crisisnomy enjoyed academic atmosphere together. 15 years ago, on December 29, 2006, Chungbuk National University established the National Crisisnomy Institute for the first time in the global society in the field of crisis and emergency management. And in the just next year, after the establishment of NCI of CBNU, the first ICCEM was held here on November 8th to 10th, 2007. After then, for 15 years, ICCEM has been held annually in Korea, China, Japan, United States, Portugal, Switzerland, Singapore, and Nepal, held by ICCEM and Chungbuk National University. Chungbuk National University has done what no other university has been able to do. CBNU has made a tremendous contribution to the birth and the development of crisis management science. It's a new science, crisisnomy, a new discipline to respect and realize human dignity, human life, and human rights, which are universal values of human society. In this context, ICCEM members sincerely congratulate Chungbuk National University on its 70th anniversary. And we will remember the contribution of Chungbuk National University to the academic birth and development of crisis NOMI. Dear my old friends, the global society must secure human security, economic security, and environmental security, as you now see in placard, to protect the safety, happiness, and peace of human society from climate crisis and various disasters. Nowadays, climate crisis is one of the biggest challenges that human society must solve today. There are lots of crises and disasters which have afflicted the human society. For example, at the individual level, suicide, crime, traffic accidents, industrial accidents, infectious disease like COVID-19 or MERS threaten the happiness of an individual's life. At the local and community level, disasters such as flood, typhoons, tsunamis, earthquakes, heat waves, heavy snowfalls, landslide, droughts, and the severe cold weather. So many various kinds of natural disasters occur all the time in our life. At the national and international level, there are lots of threats and crises in financial system, transportation, electricity, ICT, nuclear power, dams, public health, and public order, and so on. Considering this, in this time, ICCEM has set the theme of the 15th ICCEM as climate crisis and disaster management in global society, security of human, economy, and environment. Just at this ICCEM, it is necessary to gather wisdom from the perspective of human security, economic security, and environmental security on climate crisis and disaster management, which are common tasks that the global society must solve together. As a president board member and founder of ICCEM, I would like to thank Chair Bae of the 15th ICCEM Organizing Committee. Thank you so much. The 15th ICCEM was attended by distinguished scholars and experts from Korea, China, Japan, the United States, Nepal, Pakistan, Mongolia, Chile, and Sweden, and is hosted by the ADPC, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center International Organization. Chair Bae did her best to successfully hold this 15th ICCEM. On behalf of the ICCEM members, I would like to thank Chair Bae. And I would like to express my deepest gratitude to President Kim Soo-gap of CBNU for hosting and supporting this international conference, and Chair Moon-soon Lee of the 70th Anniversary Organizing Committee of Chungbuk National University, and also Executive Director Hans Gutmann of the ATPC. And also, I would like to give my thanks to the staff and volunteers, including sincerely thank to Professor Jinik Song of our university, and Dr. Kwon, Professor Lee, and team leader Kim, who worked hard to make this 15th ICCEM a success. And above all, I would like to thank all the participants for their excellent research and presentation, despite the poor research conditions caused by COVID-19. And sincerely, I would like to give my special thanks to all the participants, attendants in our conference venue. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다. 다음은 이문순 충북대학교 기획처장님께서 환영사를 해주시겠습니다. 여러분 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Next, Dr. Moon-soon Lee, the Director of Planning Board of Chungbuk National University, will deliver his welcoming message.
안녕하십니까. 충북대학교 개교 70주년 기념 사업 추진위원장이며 기획처장 이문순입니다. 현재 지구촌을 위기로 몰아넣고 있는 코로나의 상황에서 글로벌 사회에서의 기후 위기와 재난 관리, 인간 안보, 경제 안보, 환경 안보라는 주제하에 제15차 국제 위기 관리 학회 발표와 토론에 참여해 주신 한국, 중국, 일본, 미국, 태국, 스웨덴, 네팔, 몽골, 칠레, 파키스탄의 전문가와 ADPC 관계자 여러분 진심으로 환영합니다.
Hello, everyone. I am Bunsun Lee, the head of the planning department and chairperson of the 70th anniversary commemorative project of Chungbuk National University.
네.
I sincerely welcome ADPC officials and experts from Korea, China, Japan, the United States, Thailand, Sweden, Nepal, Mongolia, Chile, and Pakistan for participating in the presentation and discussion of the 15th International Crisis Management Conference under the theme of climate crisis and disaster management in the global society, human security, economic security, and environmental security in the context of COVID-19, which is currently putting the global village into the crisis.
오늘 이 제15차 국제 위기 관리 학술 대회는 우리 충북대학교 개교 70주년을 맞이하여 국제 위기 관리 학회인 ICCEM과 공동으로 개최하는 매우 의미 있는 행사입니다.
Today's 15th International Crisis Management Conference is a very meaningful international event held jointly with ISCEM, the International Crisis Management Society, to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the foundation of Chungbuk National University.
지난 70여 년간 우리 충북대학교는 진리, 정의, 개척의 기체 아래 지역사회와 국가사회 그리고 국제사회의 공동발전과 인류사회의 진리 탐구, 인재 육성을 위해 노력해 왔습니다.
For the past 70 years, under the intrinsic value of truth, justice, and making the new path, Chungbuk National University has been striving to explore the truth and nurture talents for the common development of local, national, and international communities and for the safety and happiness of the human society.
이제 70년의 역사를 넘어 100년의 미래를 향해 나아가는 충북대학교는 글로벌 사회의 지속 가능한 발전을 위해 기후 위기와 탄소 중립 이행을 위해서 열심히 준비하고 있습니다.
Now going beyond the 70 years history and moving toward the 100 years future, Chungbuk National University is preparing for the climate crisis and carbon neutral implementation for the sustainable development of the global society.
이러한 맥락에서 국제위기관리학회와 충북대학교가 앞으로 많은 공동연구와 교육 프로그램을 통하여 운영할 수 있는 방안을 마련하기 위한 노력을 지속적으로 기울여 나가겠습니다.
For the better future, the International Crisis Management Society and Chungbuk National University will make efforts to come up with a way to operate many joint research and educational programs in the future.
오늘 그 국제위기관리학회 조직위원회 배정희 의장님 그리고 충북대학교 국가위기관리연구소 소장 이재현 교수님 그리고 ADPC의 한스 구트만 집행위원님께 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다.
Moreover, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the chairman Jung Bae of the 15th ICCEM Organizing Committee, the Professor Jen Lee, and the Director of the National Crisis Management Institute at Chungbuk National University, and Hans Gutman, and Executive Chairman of ADPC.
마지막으로 이 가을 학문적으로 멋진 수학을 기대하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Finally, I look forward to a wonderful academic harvest this fall. Thank you for listening.
네, 감사합니다. 다음으로 저희 공동 주체인 UN 지원기구인 ADPC가 보내온 축사 영상을 보도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you. And now we will watch the welcoming message from ADPC.
Disasters linked to climate and weather extremes are becoming more frequent and intense. And although some of the greatest recent disasters were seismic, such as earthquakes and tsunamis, or biological, such as COVID-19, Weather and climate-related disasters make up almost 90% of all disasters and includes heat waves, floods, droughts, storms such as typhoons, cyclones, hurricanes, storm surges, landslides, glacial lakes, outburst floods, etc. And these weather and climate-related disasters are costing the world economy $500 billion each year, or approximately 2.5% of the combined government budgets in the world. The climate crisis disasters are considered by many the biggest threat to us all and affects human security, economic security, and environmental security. As a result, business as usual is not an option. Science informs us that climate change is real and already happening. And the ongoing COP26 is telling us that now is a time for bold actions, collectively, to protect the safety, happiness, and peace of global society. In essence, protect the future. As in all difficulties, there is also opportunities. New and efficient technology has made renewable energy the cheapest source of energy in many places. But it's not yet at the scale that is big enough. And it's still operating under the carbon economy mechanisms. Think about it. Many renewables, such as wind, solar, and hydropower, do not have a cost for the few, the basis for the carbon economy. So here, there is scope for innovation. Similarly, nature-based solutions are efficient in addressing the socio-environmental issues, such as water security, water pollution, food security, biodiversity loss, etc., including disaster risk management. At ADPC, we offer innovative solutions to effectively and appropriately build the resilience of people and systems to climate extremes and climate change in Asia and the Pacific. ADPC's Climate Resilience Department focuses on the development of climate risk information, tools, techniques, and systems to be used in climate risk reduction and management and climate change adaptation plans in multiple sectors. The innovative solutions address the climate crisis by, firstly, mainstreaming climate risk into the broader agenda of sustainable development, raising the capacities of modeling of weather events and climate change, and supporting climate risk management and climate adaptation. It also promotes end-to-end early warning systems, and finally work on enabling communities at risk to take action to protect their lives and livelihoods. To take one step further in addressing the climate crisis and strengthen climate and disaster resilience, governments, businesses, civil society, scholars, experts, youth, and academia need to work together to share their knowledge and experiences from the perspective of human security, economic security, and environmental security on climate crisis and disaster management. ADPC will be there to help and support, but it's an effort we need to work together. Thank you very much.
로리 오데아 교수님의 특강 해설과 제8회 국제교류전에 대한 내용에 대한 발제에 먼저 들어가도록 하겠습니다. 진익송 교수님께서는 단상으로 나와 자리해 주시기 바랍니다.
Now we will have an explanation of the lecture from Rory O.D. and give an introduction of the ACE International Networking Conference. Professor Ik Sung-jin, please come to the stage.
예. Thank you.
Happy 70th anniversary, Trinidad National University.
Congratulations! Happy 70 years anniversary, Chunguk National University. I am Filippo from Budapest, Hungary.
로리 교수의 강의 발제를 맡은 진익성 교수입니다. 오늘 아까 보여드린 영상은 올 봄에 저희 학교가 70주년 기념 행사를 하게 돼서 그동안 저희들이 우리 미술과 교수님들이 학생들을 위해서 7회째, 올해가 이제 8회째입니다. 그런데 우리 학교가 이제 70주년이 돼서 기획처의 이문순 기획처장님께서 저를 부르셔서 우리 학교 70주년 기념 행사로 이렇게 같이 했으면 좋겠다고 말씀을 주셨습니다. 그래서 그때부터 이제 새롭게 이제 8회를 준비를 하게 됐는데, 우리 7개 대학과 우리 학교 미술과 학생들과 같이 조인을 하게 돼서 총 8개 대학 총 63명의 작가들이 어떤 그레이드 구분이 없이 함께 조인을 해서 이렇게 국제전을 열게 되었습니다. 마침 우리 학교가 70주년 행사를 하면서 우리 학교 로고가 박힌 이 아름다운 캐틀로그를 온라인과 오프라인 상에서 전 세계로 지금 퍼져나가고 있습니다. 그래서 제가 이거를 먼저 온라인 상에 이제 오픈을 시키고 나서는 이 캐틀로그를 실제 또 참가하는 학생들에게 다 이제 보냈는데, 제가 우체국에서 잠깐 생각이 들었는데, 이것이 아마 4, 50년 후에 받을 편지를 미리 보내는 것이 아닐까 하는 생각을 들었어요. 그래서 이게 무슨 뜻이냐 하면, 제가 학생들에게 이야기했습니다. 너희들 세대는 실현할지 모르겠지만은 혹시 너희가 나중에 유명한 작가가 돼서 나이가 70대, 80대 돼서 뉴욕을 방문하거나 또는 헝가리나 마케도니아를 방문했을 때, 또는 정 그게 안 된다면 너희들의 이제 자녀들이나 또 손자나 이런 가족들이 혹시라도 뉴욕에서 화단에 활동을 하거나 그쪽 학교에 유학을 가게 됐을 때 우연히 어느 도서관이나 학교 도서관에서 여기 충북대학교 로고가 적혀 있는 책이 있네. 그리고 뒤져보니까 우리 어머니가 있어. 우리 아빠가 있어. 또 나이가 들었는데, 여러분 나이가 들어서 80이 됐는데 갔는데 40년 전에 전시했던 게 뉴욕이나 헝가리에 있다면 얼마나 반갑겠어요. 그래서 제가 생각했습니다. 이것이 40년 후, 50년 후에 받아올 편지를 지금 이게 보내는 것 같은 생각이 잠시 들었습니다. 이러한 점이 일종의 매핑 작업이라고 저는 생각을 하는데, 우리가 지역에 두 가지 큰 요소가 있지 않습니까? 지역적인 요소, 지정학적인 요소, 거기다 역사적인 요소. 그게 우리의 한국인이라는, 또 충청도인이라는, 충북대학이라는 아이덴티티가 형성이 되는 거 아니겠어요? 근데 거기서 그 인간관계의 확정을 통해서 그 매핑 작업이 전 세계로 이제 넓어지는 것이라고 저는 생각을 합니다. 그래서 이러한 이제 어제 로리 교수가 보낸 저기 발표문을 제가 잠깐 읽었는데, 로리 교수가 그 이야기를 하더군요. 이제 홀로세 다음에 인류세는 아직 우리가 학문적으로 합의가 이루어지지는 않았지만은 우리 인류가 자연에게 급격하게 영향을 끼치는 세대라고 이야기를 하더군요. 그러니까 재난까지 포함해서. 그래서 어떤 분들은 산업시대 때부터 이야기를 하고, 어떤 분은 이제 2차 대전이 끝난 1945년 원자폭탄이 터졌던 그 시점부터라고 이야기를 하기도 합니다. 그래서 우리 인류가 정말 이제는 지역을 초월해서 우리 재난에 우리 예술이 어떻게 대응할 것인가, 그리고 우리 예술가들이 어떤 역할로 이 시대를 살아갈 것인가 하는 점에 대해서 아마 로리 교수가 상세하게 설명을 해 주실 것 같아요. 그래서 이런 시점에 우리의 충북대학의 그 아이덴티티의 매핑이 점점 넓어지고 또 우리 학생들이 정말 전 세계를 향해서 여러분의 가치와 그 소중함을 전 세계 인류들과 같이 공유하고 인류의 닥친 문제를 같이 이야기하고 해결하게 하는 그런 어떤 기제가 될 수 있지 않을까 하는 그런 생각을 해봤습니다.
Good afternoon and welcome. I am Dr. Rory O'Day, Professor of Contemporary Art and Design at the Parsons School of Design in New York City. In the early days of spring 2020, the coronavirus was transmitted across and around the world like a pulse speeding through the grid of our globalized society, with at least one case of infection reported in 182 of 202 countries globe-wide. At the same time, unprecedented swarms of locusts, breathtaking in their expanse and density, swept through East Africa and West Asia, blanketing the sky in darkness and devouring all vegetation in their path. On June 20th, 2020, a temperature of 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius was recorded in Siberia, the highest temperature ever measured above the Arctic Circle. The staggeringly high temperature was connected to what is described as zombie fires, a portentous term that describes the return of a fire from the past that was never fully extinguished. And as various nations of the world present at the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, as I speak, non-committally pledge to end deforestation, the magisterial forests of California in the United States burn day after day at a rate of irrevocable loss. The artists Berndau Schmilde and Mary Mattingly's artworks capture the collective feeling of this moment of crisis. The crises of the present hangs over us like an invisible cloud of unknowing, its seemingly unbearable weight pressing down upon our bodies to the point of suffocation. To quote the iconic climate activist Greta Thunberg, "I want you to panic." The present state of emergency is amplified and accelerated by the cascade of crises spectacularly narrated by the media every day. The coronavirus eclipses climate change, which eclipses the global refugee crisis, which eclipses the financial crisis, which eclipses unending war in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. The rabbit holes and wormholes of the contemporary social media scape vertiginously contract and expand time and space, and there is seemingly no possibility to coherently pass through the stages of emotion to make sense of the crisis or thoughtfully formulate responses to it. Increasingly isolated in our media bubbles, we are exposed to lies, rumors, threats, inconvenient truths, and alternative facts. In the words of the American scholar W.J.T. Mitchell, quote, "It's not just our machines that are infected with viruses today, but the human brains connected to them." As such, the increasing ferocity of the storms that ravage the exterior landscapes of the Earth in the time of climate crisis is met in equal measure by the media storms that ravage the interior landscapes of our minds. While the reality created within the total environment of media immersion makes the crisis feel inescapable, it also serves as a dangerous source of pacifying illusion and remove. In his book, 24/7, Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep, Jonathan Crary argues that permanent connectivity produces, quote, "the final capitalist mirage of post-history." And our ever-increasing enclosure in a virtual cocoon allows us to be blind to the destruction of nature around us. Crary continues, quote, "The more one identifies with the insubstantial electronic surrogates for the physical self, the more one seems to conjure an exemption from the biocide underway everywhere on the planet. COVID-19, climate change, and capitalism are, in fact, inextricably entangled. The coronavirus emerged from human interactions with animals whose habitats have been destroyed. It consequently was transmitted along global lines of trade and transportation. Yet, neoliberal and extractive capitalism does not just create or contribute to these crises, it also feeds upon them. In his 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, the American economist Milton Friedman, widely considered as the intellectual architect of neoliberal capitalism, argued that, quote, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable, end quote. In her book titled The Shock Doctrine, the journalist Naomi Klein reinterprets Friedman's economics, which views tragedy as opportunity, as what she calls disaster capitalism. Klein says, with resource scarcity and climate change providing a steadily increasing flow of new disasters, responding to emergencies is simply too hot an emerging market to be left to the nonprofits. The moment of radically disorienting shock produced by crises often leads to what philosophers and theorists Carl Schmitt, Walter Benjamin, and most recently, Giorgio Agamben have described as a state of exception. Agamben underscores the ambiguous and paradoxical character of this exceptional condition of emergency, during which time the rules of law and order are often suspended in the name of restoring the normal conditions of law and order. At its most dystopian, the state of exception takes on deranged forms, such as the United States' unending war on terror following the rupture of the 9/11 attacks. Yet, the state of exception can also marshal people and resources in radically new and productive ways, as we are currently witnessing in the form of state interventions, in the form of curfews, quarantines, lockdowns, and large-scale economic stimulus programs as a means to collectively combat the coronavirus. While this contemporary state of exception is politically fraught, some argue the cure is worse than the disease, it undoubtedly demonstrates the power of humans to act on a global scale and stunningly refutes the rote dismissal of the climate movement's demands as totally unrealistic or naively idealistic. In his recent book, Corona, Climate, and Chronic Emergency, the Marxist ecologist Andreas Malm makes a case for the current state of exception as a catalyst for the implementation of the radical yet necessary response to climate change. Malm argues that, quote, Corona and climate share a structural quality that invites comparison. The amount of death is a function of the amount of action or inaction of the states. If, as a society, we have been willing and able to take previously unimaginable measures to stop the pandemic, why can we not do the same for the far greater threat of the climate crisis? Crisis represents a rupture in the normal flow of life, and in so doing triggers a potentially fertile moment of destabilization that creates opposing opportunities to either re-entrench and amplify the values of the lost normalcy. Here we can think of Donald Trump's mantra to make America great again, or to deconstruct the normalcy that created the crisis in the first place and imagine radical new possibilities within the new spaces that have been opened by it. While times of crisis undoubtedly cause real loss and real destruction, they also vividly demonstrate that things could be otherwise. In the book, The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh proposes that, quote, the climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination. I tend to agree, and the potential power of art, to my mind, lies in its ability to critically and speculatively envision what this otherwise might be. Given the scale of the crises facing the human and non-human world, the claim that art may have a meaningful role to play may sound equally hubristic and naive. Indeed, the centrality of art to life and its political efficacy has been increasingly called into question. In his lectures on aesthetics and the fine arts presented between 1820 and 1821, the German philosopher Hegel expressed his doubt about the enduring importance and urgency of art in human life, calling into question its capacity to see humans through the unending storms they face. Hegel states, quote, for us, art counts no longer as the highest mode in which truth fashions an existence for itself. We may well hope that art always rises higher and comes to perfection, but the form of art has ceased to be the supreme need of the spirit. In a 1967 essay titled Language and Crisis, the French-American critic George Steiner expressed even deeper skepticism about the transformative powers of art, observing that a Nazi concentration camp commander could read the poetry of Goethe and Rilke in the evening and still carry out his inhuman duties at Auschwitz in the morning, a stinging paradox that the author took as evidence that art had failed the loftiest ambitions of the human spirit in the face of its greatest crisis. Yet, in 2017, 50 years after the publication of Steiner's essay, the philosopher Santiago Zabala released a book provocatively titled, Why Only Art Can Save Us. The claim of this title bears repeating. Only art can save us. Can he actually believe this to be true? Zabala's title is an adaptation of the philosopher Martin Heidegger's despair-inflected assertion in a 1966 interview, quote, that only a God can save us. This existential loss of faith is parodically literalized by Zabala's selection of Maurizio Cattelan's sculptural installation, The Ninth Hour, to grace the cover of his book. In this iconoclastic work, Cattelan presents a blood-red tableau in which Pope John Paul II has been struck down by a meteorite. His crushed and prostrate body surrounded by the glass shards that symbolize his shattered faith in the divine beneficence of the cosmos. For Heidegger, the emergency of the present is not the loss of divine order emblematized by the authority of the Pope, but rather the loss of being, what he called Dasein, which is analogous to Hegel's sense of the human spirit considered above, in a world dominated by the totalizing and instrumental vision of media and technology. For Zabala, the lack of a sense of emergency arises from the fact that we are collectively trapped within the world picture of neoliberal capitalism, which separates us from the flow of real life and encounters with the world and one another that is the essence of being. The eruptions of emergencies into everyday life, whether it be the refugee crisis, terrorist attacks, catastrophic forest fires, or a global pandemic, are not themselves the emergency, but rather are moments when the catastrophes and derangements that define normal life are temporarily made visible to us or amplified. The real crisis for Zabala is the desire for things to return to normal. Normal here being defined by the so-called safety of the frame of the globalized system that produced the emergency to begin with. Despite the fact that the media inundates us with an avalanche of catastrophic events and emergencies, Zabala argues that we are trapped in such an extensive control system that the predominant impression is that real change is impossible. Art, arguably, is uniquely positioned to reveal the frame we are trapped within. In so doing, art jars us from our numbness to crisis. Heidegger thus distinguishes between those who rescue us from the false emergency and those who rescue us into the true emergency. As an antidote to Naomi Klein's shock doctrine that describes the ways in which global powers exploit the disorientation and paralysis caused by crisis for their own ends, the radical shock of art is a means of altering and expanding the imposed representation of reality and the modes of being, both human and non-human, that it allows for. For Zabala, true emergency, quote, results from our noticing an alteration within the world picture. But the lack of a sense of emergency emerges when we realize that everything is lucid and functioning correctly. The goal of art, consequently, is to awaken us to the crisis. While art conceived in this way may be part of the solution, in its conventional forms and institutional settings, it emphatically risks being part of the problem to the extent that it reinforces and reproduces the structures of power that must be eradicated if we are to liberate ourselves from a state of chronic emergency. In other words, when the work of art and its reception are constrained by pre-existing conceptual and aesthetic categories and institutional frameworks, there is no possibility to move into the reality of the unknown. A truly radical form of art cannot be contained within existing institutions and frameworks of knowledge. It is unknowable in the language of convention, and thus its revolutionary charge arises from its demand for the creation of new ways of knowing and being. I would like to return to the concept of the zombie fire alluded to at the outset of my talk today, as it strikes me as an all too perfect, yet also terrifying metaphor for the return of the repressed in the Anthropocene, what the German theorist Max Horkheimer described as nature's revolt. In the context of the climate crisis, the revolt of nature, what we might describe as nature fighting and biting back, signifies the moment when the human exploitation of the ecological systems of the earth causes a rupture in those systems, and thus what had been perceived as the unlimited resources and harmony of the natural world turns into a source of menace and threat. This rupture negatively transfigures the plenitude of the natural world into an abyss of unknowing. In the age of the Anthropocene, the philosopher Eugene Thacker proposes that, quote, the world is increasingly unthinkable, a world of planetary disasters, emerging pandemics, tectonic shifts, strange weather, oil-drenched seascapes, and the furtive, always looming threat of extinction. In spite of our daily concerns, wants, and desires, it is increasingly difficult to comprehend the world in which we live and which we are a part. To confront this idea is to confront an absolute limit to our ability to adequately understand the world at all. Indeed, life in the times of the pandemic and climate crisis becomes increasingly uncanny, increasingly unpredictable, and under the pressures of anthropogenic changes of the planet, the very materiality and reality and familiarity of the world as we once knew it can no longer be taken for granted. One of the most unsettling aspects of the COVID-19 crisis has been the manner in which it has subverted the banalities and rituals of everyday life into sources of anxiety, fear, and doubt. Handshakes become taboo. To cough in public borders on being a crime. In her work, Tender Balance from 2021, the American artist Jill Magid explores the ways that the pandemic has transformed the human body into a fraught site of transaction and transmission. For this piece, the artist laser inscribed the edges of 120,000 American pennies with the phrase, "The body was already so fragile." The number of pennies equals 1,200 American dollars, which is the amount of money that many Americans received as part of the first round of the United States government's financial stimulus program during the early days of the pandemic. In the fall of 2020, Majid began conducting all of her financial transactions in the world using only these pennies, which he described as a, quote, dispersed monument that distributed coin-sized art to the people. While the initial performance represents a symbolic gesture of mutual care and artistic exchange, the deeper meaning of the work is illuminated in the subsequent installation and its mediation on the interconnected flows of finance and human bodies. A 28-minute video tracked the coin's creation and dispersal, fraught with all the episodes of touch and fear that overtook ordinary transactions with the onset of COVID-19. Here, each coin becomes a potential vehicle for the virus's spread. While many observers have commented on the ways that the virus was transmitted along the networks of neoliberal capital, this is why the wealthy nations were impacted by the virus first. The artist here literalizes the threat of money that never sleeps, that never stops moving. The sense of money encroaching upon the body itself is disturbingly materialized in an X-ray image of the artist's son with a coin lodged in his chest. More broadly, the work speaks to one of the great paradoxes of the pandemic, namely that human health and economic health are seemingly incompatible. The artistic collaborators Helen Evans and Hiko Hansen, who present their work under the shared name He, create spectral images that reveal the ecological devastation lurking outside the limits of human perception, much like the virus invisibly waiting upon the surface of a penny. In their series titled Champs d'Ozone, the artists overlay projected live images of the Paris skyline with colors representing the unseen pollutants contained within the atmosphere. The work was connected via internet to sensors positioned around the city by an independent organization that monitors the air quality in the city, which provided a real-time data feed that modulated the colors in the projections. For He, the idea of air quality is central to this work. As consumers, we are driven by a desire to acquire high-quality goods that will provide us with a high-quality lifestyle. Yet we are utterly powerless to control the quality of the air and atmosphere we are enveloped within and required to live. In pandemic times, when the very air we breathe has been transmogrified into an invisible enemy, the unnatural phosphorescent glow of He's images strike to the heart of our existential fear of nature turned against us. In his Hiding in the City series, the Chinese artist Liu Bolin enacts a form of embodied performance camouflage, allowing himself to disappear into the urban spaces he dwells within. While the disillusion of boundaries separating figure from ground, subject from object, suggest a Taoist metaphysics of oneness with the world, the excess materiality present in this image counters any such transcendental interpretations. In this work, Liu is absorbed in the abyssal darkness of a mound of coal. Coal, of course, has been a singular driving force behind China's rapid economic development, manifested in industrialization, urbanization, and excessive consumption. Devoid of regulation, China's coal mines experience regular explosions, cave-ins, and other fatal disasters, while also being a major contributor to air pollution, a leading cause of premature death. For Liu, quote, coal pile is a conceptual commentary on the consequences of not only the dependence on coal, a limited resource, but the dangers that come for families who work with and use coal, ironically, to survive. At the same time, the coal crisis signified by Liu's image offers an object lesson in Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism. While the notorious smog that blankets Beijing and other northern cities wreaks havoc on the lives and health of its residents, others have exploited this environmental crisis for profit. For example, a prominent property developer was reported to have recommended that all real estate developers install air filtration systems in their buildings. Rather than address the root of the problem to benefit all, entrepreneurs instead capitalize on the disaster. In this scenario, the very right to breathe becomes commodified. By surrendering his individuality, by being absorbed into the lumpen black mass of coal that fuels China's economic expansion, Liu's image reveals the paradox that arises when the socialist and Confucian ideologies that call for collectivism are combined with the individual freedom of consumer choice demanded by global capitalism. Indeed, such a contradiction is a defining characteristic of the climate crisis. We are told to consume more and more as our economic growth depends on it. Yet we must also take personal responsibility for climate change and selflessly modify our patterns of consumption if disaster is to be averted. More broadly, coal can be seen as a signifier of the history of industrialization and its inevitable collapse in the face of entropy. Ironically, the Frankenstein-like second law of thermodynamics, that is entropy, was discovered in the very process of scientific experiments in pursuit of a perfectly efficient steam engine. And the concept of entropy is thus inseparable from the 19th century's inexorable drive for technological process and the material transcendence it promised. The more humans were able to harness the energy of the earth, the more they accelerated the planet toward entropic dissolution. This is known as the Jevons paradox. In the 19th century, the economist William Stanley Jevons observed that despite steam engines becoming progressively more efficient in their use of coal, this technological advance did not reduce the burning of coal overall, since the increases in efficiency inevitably led to the expansion of the number of steam engines and the excessive growth they engendered. Consequently, the outcome of all production is some kind of waste. In Liu's image, these timescales of natural history and human history collide. The lumpen masses of coal represent the material compression of millions of years that imaginatively casts us back into a pre-human geological past, and the accelerating consumption of coal in the present projects us into the darkness of a post-human future. The Israeli artist Nadav Kander creates photographic images that vividly capture the accelerated material transformations of life in the 21st century and the radically defamiliarizing and destabilizing effects these transformations have upon us. The dizzying pace of industrial modernization that is unfolding in China strikes Kander as a stunning expression of the monumental anthropogenic transformations of the environment. And he describes his sense that, quote, China is a nation that appears to be severing its roots by destroying its past in the wake of the sheer force of its moving forward at such an astounding and unnatural pace. His images, whose eerily still environments are devoid of human figures, intimate a post-human future. While these architectural monuments of modernity threaten to consume the natural landscape, Kander's representation of them suggests that they somehow simultaneously rise and fall into a ruinous state of rubble. While his carefully composed compositions display a precise and subtle formal beauty, the sense of transience they conjure takes on a haunting dimension in the uncertain future of the Anthropocene. Given the scale of changes that have already been set in motion, Kander speculates that, quote, These are photographs that can never be taken again. The evocations of a calamitous and disappearing present demand a rigorous inquiry into the histories that have brought us to this moment of contemporary crisis. The Nigerian artist John Akomfra's 2015 film installation Vertigo Sea exemplifies the political and poetic power of art to excavate forgotten histories and discover the nexus of intersecting forces that lie in the wake of the present. Akomfra's sublime work takes the ocean as its fluid historical medium. Drawing together archival footage with his own cinematic imagery, the artist crafts a sweeping visual narrative of the natural and human histories that have unfolded upon the surface and in the depths of the sea. Breathtakingly beautiful images of curling waves and swarming aquatic life are coupled with devastating images of the ravages of the whaling industry, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and the contemporary migration crisis. Rather than a seamless narrative flow, Akomfra fractures this history of the sea across the three screens of his installation, and the spectator must dialectically resolve the contradictions and clash of the visual imagery before them. This is the experience of vertigo to which the title of the work refers, as the vast scale of its history of past violence cannot be resolved without action in the present. As the art historian T.J. Demos suggests, quote, "In Vertigo Sea, the intimation of renewal only comes after brutal destruction, giving rise to perhaps more of an emotional desire and yearning for reparation than showing any realization of post-apocalyptic flourishing," end quote. The undeniable aesthetic beauty and poetry of Akomfra's film cannot be overstated, but rather than absolve us of the sins of history through the transcendent and cleansing power of art, the visual pleasure we take from his film, experienced at a privilege removed from the horrors it exposes, makes us complicit in this history that continues to wash over us wave-like and live on in the present. While Akomfra's work looks to the past in order to make sense of the present, many artists working today take the path of imagining the future. Indeed, the dystopian imagination of science fiction increasingly feels like the new realism of the Anthropocene. In his text, Metamorphosis of Science Fiction, the theorist Darko Suvin argues that the science fiction genre's dialectic between science and fiction produces an intense experience of cognitive estrangement. By establishing an imaginative and alternative world that is necessarily different from the reader or viewer's empirical environment, science fiction offers a disorienting and distorted perspective on reality, both in terms of how it is experienced as well as how it is naturalized by literary and visual representations. In essence, the unique aesthetic and critical force of science fiction arises from the coexistence of the known and unknown, the familiar and the unfamiliar, and the mere possibility of the latter represents a challenge to the ontological ground of the former. Moon Kyung-won and Jian Junhoo's 2012 work, El Fin del Mundo, or The End of the World, is a 13-minute film installation that presents a speculative dystopian future in which genetic engineering and biotechnology have gone awry. Set in the late 21st century, the film begins in the aftermath of a global catastrophe that has submerged most of the world below water and wiped out the majority of the human population. Survivors now eke out a life in a chaotic post-apocalyptic environment in which all semblance of order, values, democratic government, and social systems have collapsed. But a small number of corporations have survived the catastrophe. Using the survivors' labor, which is acquired through the promise of the restoration of the material comforts of their former lives, the corporations now compete with one another to acquire total dominance of the New World Order. The End of the World is clearly influenced by science fiction cinema and explores common tropes of dystopian fiction, such as the lone survivor in the midst of an apocalyptic disaster and the emergence of totalitarian governmental and corporate powers that the last remnants of humanity must rebel against. For Moon and Jiang, quote, "Sci-fi is always the fable of the present. By employing a way to look at the future instead of the present, we wanted to address current issues, especially in relation to what art is and what art can be." While The End of the World can be read as a necessary cautionary tale about the fate of humanity and the planet, if the technological imagination, driven by power, profit, and hubris, is allowed to continually run amok, the visual seduction of its sci-fi poetics risks aestheticizing the myriad crises we face. Rather than proposing real solutions, works like The End of the World risk fatalistically dwelling in our collective fascination with futuristic nightmares. Here, the boundaries between critical art and popular culture dangerously dissolve. As the journalist Naomi Klein argues, the aesthetic of pop apocalyptics, quote, "is so much a part of our culture that we think all we are capable of doing is becoming like society portrayed in films like Snowpiercer, Elysium, or The Hunger Games." It's actually not controversial to say this is where we're headed. The question is, can we imagine another way of responding to crisis other than one of deepening inequality, brutal disaster capitalism, and mangled techno fixes? Because that seems to be where, in this regard, people agree we are heading. End quote. The ecological threat posed by the climate crisis, and starkly represented in the number of images seen here today, foreshadows an increasingly uninhabitable planet, and consequently, the very real possibility of human extinction. This is the post-human reality to which I have alluded to thus far. But the COVID-19 crisis we find ourselves within signals a different possible meaning of the term post-human. Rather than the end of humans, the viral nature of life in the 21st century suggests the radical transformation of what it means to be human. Or rather, it reveals that we have never quite been fully human in the way conceived by humanism. The modern concept of the human subject is rooted in its rigid separation from nature. Instrumentalizing the power of reason, which is what we believe distinguishes us from the brute matter of nature, humans develop tools and technology that exponentially increase the distance between themselves and the natural world. While this historical telos of modernity results in humanity's increasing alienation from nature, it also reduces nature to an inert object of domination. The paradox of climate change is that the more the natural world is exploited by humans, the more strangely alive and menacing it becomes, consequently forcing us to further distance ourselves from it. This is indeed a vicious cycle. Posthumanism, however, represents the end of a system of belief rooted in the inviolable boundary between the human and the non-human world. And the scholar Tobias Rees has described COVID-19 as the great undifferentiation event. Without minimizing the very real and ongoing devastation and loss wrought by the virus, at the same time, the pandemic urgently calls into question the belief in human exceptionalism and our presumed right to be masters of the natural world. COVID-19 proliferates through zoonotic spillover, meaning the virus spreads across species. Bats, pangolins, and humans form the pathways of its transmission, and humans are but one among many fertile sites for viral replication. If nothing else, the coronavirus has made us keenly aware of the interconnectedness of nature and the porosity of our bodies within it. While the virus passes freely into our bodies and we pass the virus on to others, in a sense, viral matter has always been a part of us. Recent research shows that 8% of our DNA consists of remnants of ancient viruses, and another 40% is made up of the repetitive strings of genetic letters that are also thought to have a viral origin. If we consider our viral origins in combination with the fact that the bacterial oceans of our interior gut produces the neurotransmitters that produce thought, the claim that thought itself distinguishes humans from the non-human world becomes increasingly tenuous. Annika Yee's multi-organism art practice brilliantly embodies this post-humanist vision that radically decenters an anthropomorphic conception of nature and human identity. For her exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in New York in 2017 titled Life is Cheap, Yee produced three interrelated works seen here. A group of canisters diffusing an unusual fragrance distilled from carpenter ants and sweat samples from Asian American women, a shimmering cybernetic colony containing 10,000 black ants, and an installation teeming with blooming strains of bacteria originally swabbed from surfaces in Manhattan's Chinatown and Koreatown. Yee describes her art as an exploration of the biopolitics of the senses, and the invasion of the museum by bacteria, insects, and sweat transgresses the traditional disembodied visual sensorium of the laboratory-like white cube of the modern gallery. Yee's foregrounding of the sense of smell is crucial to understanding her post-humanist practice. Vision is the sense most emphatically connected to cognition and reason, but the invisible presence of scent cannot be accessed by eyesight alone, and thus the olfactory nature of her work lowers the spectator to the level of a more animalistic, embodied aesthetic encounter. The aspect of the work is amplified by the presence of the ants, creatures who structure their social relations of their colonies based on the chemical scents emanating from one another's bodies. And while Yee's visually sumptuous tableau of bacteria, which form floral-like blooms and patterns on the resinous surfaces of her installation, does not emit a discernible scent, it reminds us that body odor is the result of bacteria feeding on chemicals in human sweat. While Yee's work predates the coronavirus, the ways in which it attunes us, perhaps uncomfortably so, to the invisible fluid exchanges between human and non-human bodies deeply reverberates through the biopolitics of the pandemic in the present. Tiffany Jae-yeon Shin's immersive and interactive installation titled Microbial Speculation of Our Gut Feeling from 2020 has the utopian aim of generating a collective space for speculating on the possibilities of transcendence, interconnection, and care that the microbial might provide. Taking up residence in a Brooklyn gallery, Shin created a do-it-yourself microbiology lab. Among the myriad makeshift scientific apparatuses to be found in the gallery are a dehydrator repurposed to make Korean rice wine, a pressure cooker to make essential oils, and a grow tent to incubate assorted baby greens sprayed with lactic acid bacteria. Like Yee, Shin is drawn to that which eludes vision, and the microscopic workings of her impromptu lab suggest a practice more akin to mystical thought than science. For Shin, the regeneration of microscopic organisms explores the possibilities for common survival, interspecies symbiosis, and mutual care. Fermentation is central to her practice. Fermentation is a process of chemical breakdown of materials by bacteria, yeasts, and other microorganisms. And for Shin, it represents a form of transformative alchemy, a force of creative destruction that dissolves and recreates the subjects and objects of the earth in an unending cycle of regeneration. In so doing, it offers a microcosmic vision of human beings harmonized with the world around them. While all of the works considered thus far have proffered critical or imaginative responses to the myriad crises we grapple with in the early 21st century, they are all contained within the sanctioned spaces of the art world, and for this reason may be seen as part of the problem rather than the solution. Why would this be the case? The most pervasive criticism of art's potential as a source of political agency and an instrument of emancipatory social transformation is its active participation and entrapment within an art world system that is inextricably implicated in the neoliberal world order that forms the poisonous roots of the current crisis. The American critic Clement Greenberg famously claimed that the avant-garde was bound to the ruling classes by an umbilical cord of gold. And this chain of connection between art and commerce stretches ever further through the inexorable expansion of the art market in the form of art fairs, international biennials, and the franchising and branding of museums. The artist and philosopher Ito Steyerl incisively articulates the current state of art world affairs. Quote, amongst all the forms of art, fine art has been most closely linked to post-Fordist speculation with bling, boom, and bust. Contemporary art is no unworldly discipline nestled away in some remote ivory tower. On the contrary, it is squarely placed in the neoliberal thick of things. We cannot dissociate the hype around contemporary art from the shock policies used to defibrillate slowing economies. Such hype embodies the effective dimension of global economies tied to Ponzi schemes, credit addiction, and bygone bull markets. Contemporary art is a brand name without a brand, ready to be slapped onto almost anything. A quick facelift touting the new creative imperative for places in need of an extreme makeover. The suspense of gambling combined with the stern pleasures of upper-class boarding school education. A licensed playground for a world confused and collapsed by dizzying deregulation. If contemporary art is the answer, the question is, how can capitalism be made more beautiful? To grasp Steyerl's point, we need only look to the sublime cosmos of abstract flows and exchanges visualized in Julie Moretu's monumental painting titled Mural, which was commissioned by the financial behemoth Goldman Sachs in 2007 for $5 million to adorn the lobby of their corporate headquarters in Manhattan. 1 year later, the global economy crashed. Hyperbolically exemplifies this complicity than Takashi Murakami, whose 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, factory-like mode of production of fine art, luxury handbags, and throwaway kitsch culture reproduces the very processes of neoliberal capitalism. In a work such as The Castle of Tin Tin, Murakami's manga-like avatar literally goes viral before the spectator's eyes, his head mutating, expanding, and replicating like a comic book allegory of capitalism's monstrous dream of unlimited growth. And while Murakami may be consciously calling attention to the art world's false pretensions of existing above and beyond the fray of systems of commerce, the ways his work feeds these systems, and in turn is abundantly well fed by them, drains away the critical potential of his work. Whether self-expressive or spectacular, art as such can be viewed as part of the problem, in that it ultimately mystifies the reality of the crisis and serves the elite who most benefit from its preservation. Since the 1960s and 1970s, the ideologies and political and financial entanglements that art museums conceal beneath the veil of purity signified by the white cube have been exposed and magnified by the critical lens of institutional critique. And this particular mode of critical art practice has intensified in the 21st century. as art museums are increasingly understood to be embedded in structures of white privilege, colonialism, urban gentrification, and extractive capitalism, while simultaneously functioning as a moral laundering service for the elite individuals and corporations who represent these institutions' umbilical cord of gold. The art and activist collective Liberate Tate exemplifies the power of contemporary forms of institutional critique, which does not merely shine a light on the museum's errors and erroneous ways, but also sets the stage for real change. In the case of Liberate Tate, the objective was to pressure the Tate Museum in the United Kingdom to divest itself from the economics, sponsorship, and propaganda of the fossil fuel industry, Titan, BP, or British Petroleum. In essence, Liberate Tate argues that the Tate's embrace of BP's corporate sponsorship facilitates a form of art washing, effectively providing a social license to pollute. While the vaunted marble halls and pristine white cubes of the Tate polish BP's cultural capital, the viscous ooze flowing from its oil wells contaminates our bodies, the land and the sea, as well as the air we breathe. Indeed, BP possesses the dangerous power to make the ocean burn. As the scholar T.J. Demos makes clear, the work of the activist art collective refuses, quote, the politics of representation alone by enacting unauthorized, or rather self-authorized, public performances of resistance to the fossil fuel cultural economy. In Liberate Tate's performative intervention Human Cost, for example, a human body drenched in an oil-like substance was presented in the galleries of Tate Britain, standing as a dark and dirty counter-image to the museum's pristine claims of autonomy from the externalities of the world. And in The Gift, Liberate Tate presented the Tate Modern with a gift of a 1.5-ton wind turbine blade for its permanent collection. Here, Liberate Tate radically revises the history of the avant-garde narrated by this Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art by adapting Marcel Duchamp's ready-made found object to the urgent conditions of the Anthropocene and a potentially sustainable future. Taken together, these activist performances expose the oil-black, dirty laundry of the art world, while also pointing to an alternative future. While the museum did not accept the gift of the wind turbine into its collection, its sponsorship by BP did come to an end in 2017. Of course, BP denied that the protests had anything to do with their decision to cut ties with the Tate. As always, it was purely a business decision. Despite BP's claims to the contrary, the very public pressure created by Liberate Tate through its visceral and embodied collective performances undeniably contributed to actual change in response to the exigencies of climate change. And while the specific issues at stake were important, in this case, the divestment of cultural institutions from toxic corporate partners, perhaps the greater meaning of Liberate Tate's work arises from the way it transformed the museum from a privately funded space for privileged aesthetic pleasure to a public square for democratic freedom and collective action, a common ground upon which social, political, and ecological change can take root. The activists Andrew Boyd and Dave Mitchell call this conjoining of art and activism beautiful trouble. The work of Liberate Tate is an exemplary instantiation of what can be accomplished when art and activism work collaboratively to hold institutions accountable for their complicity in the crises bearing down upon us. And yet, while museums are undoubtedly powerful institutions in terms of their economics and the cultural capital they distribute in the form of art washing, they are ultimately not the root of the problem. To find this, art must move beyond the cultural confinement of the museum. The New York-based art activist group MTL Collective describes the new possibilities that emerge when doing so. Quote, what if, as artists and cultural producers, When we speak of art and activism, we put both under erasure. What if we strike art to liberate it from itself? Not to end art, but to free it from the circuits of capital, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and death, and unleash its powers to imagine that which is not immediately apparent. And what if, as we reject the specialization of activism, we choose a never-ending process of experimentation and question, or we choose, as the Zapatistas say, to make the path by walking. The work of Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla exemplifies this radical new artistic activist ethos. In their work titled Chalk, the artist installed human-sized columns of chalk in public spaces and squares in the cities of Lima, Peru, Zapopan, Mexico, Sydney, Paris, Boston, and New York. While the vertical monolithic form of the chalk initially evoked the imposing monumental architecture of state power, the monuments were quickly toppled and transformed from symbolic representations of power to actual usable instruments of revolutionary change. Describing the work, the artists write, quote, "Chalk synthesizes several strands of art history: minimalism, process art, happenings, conceptual art, critical public art, and performance, among others, to pose essential questions about the nature of the communication systems we build, ranging from monolithic machines to means of personal and intimate expression. At once a geological substance and writing tool, chalk can be experienced as a place of entropy, with monumental cylinders becoming ruins, and as a place of complex social and political exchange. By making available emancipatory new forms of aesthetic and political expression, the artist enact the critical theorist Walter Benjamin's vision of political art. In his 1934 essay, The Author as Producer, Benjamin argued that the goal of a truly dynamic political art is not the expression of the correct political content, but rather is a matter of creating a new mode of production that either deconstructs or proposes an alternative to the dominant order of society. While the crumbling of the chalk, which the artists describe in terms of entropy, symbolically expresses the dissolution of the old and repressive systems of power, the chalk itself became a literal means of speaking truth to that power and writing the script for the future that comes after it. Here, this ephemeral monument to the commons and to the people activates their latent revolutionary power while simultaneously exposing the authoritarian power of the state. When the work was installed in Lima, Peru, it became the catalyst for a mass protest against the abusive powers of the state, whose forces were eventually summoned to break up the protest, remove the chalk monuments, and wash away the language of the revolution to come from the ground of the public square. But the traces remain. Rather than negating the political power of the work, the intervention by the state amplified its meaning. The dark forces of oppression were drawn into the daylight. This is what Heidegger means by art's power to thrust us into the emergency. I would like to conclude my lecture today by pausing to mourn what has been lost in the crisis. The endless unfolding of one crisis after another, the experience of which is magnified by our collective act of death strolling through social media in search of information and answers, has denied us the time to grieve what has been lost and to look to the work ahead with clear eyes. Crisis and the powers that exploit it feed on this inability to stop and make sense of the world. The artist Raphael Lozana Hemmer's new work titled A Crack in the Hourglass, an ongoing COVID-19 memorial, is an invitation to do just this. In this work, Lozano Hemmer poses the question of how we can memorialize and visualize the extraordinary loss of life caused by COVID-19, even as it continues to rage on throughout the world. The artist responds with a participatory and ephemeral anti-monument for the time of the pandemic and the ways that it has halted rituals of mourning. For this work, the public is invited to submit photographs of loved ones lost to the coronavirus, along with personal dedications and eulogies to accompany the images. Presented in a gallery and live streamed online, the photographs are recreated by a plotter that deposits grains of hourglass sand onto a black stage. After each portrait is completed, it is slowly erased by gravity as the grains of sand slowly fall away. The entire process is archived on the website, and the same sand is then recycled into the next portrait, forming a potentially unlimited number of memorials and emphasizing the collective and ongoing nature of the pandemic. While this work offers a poetic meditation on human loss and the possibility of regeneration, I feel it also powerfully speaks to the urgency of the climate crisis. As the grains of the hourglass sand fall away one after another, the work offers a sober reminder that time is running out. So, the time to act is now.
여기에 우리 한국 작가를 우리 로리 교수께서 몇몇 한국 작가를 이제 연구를 했었네요. 그리고 그 중에 제니퍼 리라는 작가, 그러니까 플러싱이라든지 한국 한인타운하고 그 저기 맨하탄의 코리안타운에 가서 거기 개미들 이렇게 모으고 이렇게 냄새로 그 악취 나는 냄새로 이렇게 전시를 했던 그 작가의 한국 이름이 이순신 작가입니다. 여성 작가입니다. 그리고 또 다른 몇몇 작가, 우리 한국 작가를 연구를 이렇게 했네요. 그래서 그것을 잠깐 언급을 하자면 이순신 작가는 그러니까 우리가 기존에 우리가 알아왔던 화이트 큐브 안에서 시각적으로 느껴왔던 체험을 냄새로 후각으로 전이시키는 그런 작업을 한 거죠. 그러면서 시각으로 깨달는 게 아니라 후각으로 깨달은 느낌을 느끼게 하는 그런 작업, 전도되는 작업을 한 거죠. 아까 제가 매핑이라는 이야기를 했는데 우리의 정체성이 지금 보세요. 이게 로리 교수가 어제 저녁에 보는 게 우리가 매핑 작업이 늘어졌지 않습니까? 뉴욕을 이게 끌어오고 그다음에 우리 한국이 헝가리도 가고 마케도니아도 가고 전시를 하면서 아마 우리 학생들은 이번에 전시가 아마 하나의 매핑 작업이었을 거예요. 그래서 여러분들의 의식 세계가 이 지역에서 확장이 돼서 뉴욕과 헝가리와 마케도니아까지 아우르는 그런 새로운 매핑 작업이 되어간 것이죠. 그래서 이런 전도되는 사상이 이게 현대 시대 아까 저 인류세 시대에 이제는 뭐 도리 없이 전 세계가 막 서로 뭐 굉장히 급속하게 서로 이제 주고받는 이런 시대에 바뀌고 새로운 매핑 작업이 활발하게 일어난 시대에 대해서 여러 가지 상황에 대해서 이렇게 로리 교수께서 언급을 하신 것 같습니다. 지금까지 고생하셨던 우리 이재현 교수님 정말 감사드리고 제가 사실 올 봄에 이 프로젝트를 맡으면서 되게 고민을 많이 했습니다. 이걸 다 어떻게 아름답게 종료를 할 때까지 아름답게 이게 진행을 할 수 있나고 고민을 많이 했는데 이제 해피엔딩이 된 것 같습니다. 그나마 또 거기에다가 선물까지 또 예기치 않게 받아와서 우리 학교에 70주년 기념 선물까지 받아오게 되고 일을 진행하면서 얼마나 몸은 힘들었지만은 얼마나 행복한 일들이 많았는지요. 그래서 별다른 사고 없이 우리 학생들과 정말 잊을 수 없는 좋은 추억을 가졌고 우리 동료 교수님 또 한혜진 교수님 평론 그리고 우리 권설아 센터장님 제일 고생이 많으셨어요. 권설아 센터장님 이거 준비하신다라고 정말 제가 옆에서 보기에 정말 안타깝게 짝이 없게 정말 시간을 엄청나게 고생을 하셨습니다. 우리 센터장님께 우리 박수를 한번 부탁할까요? 자, 감사합니다. 이제 여러분과 함께 또 유익한 시간을 가진 것으로 생각하고 이 날씨도 추운데 이 자리에 함께 해주셔서 정말 진심으로 감사드립니다. 감사합니다.
네, 이상으로 제70주년 충북대학교 기념 및 제15차 ICCEM의 컨퍼런스의 첫 순서인 로리 오데아 교수님의 특강을 마치겠습니다. 참석해 주신 내외인 여러분 감사합니다.